A little bit about Oak Grove. Is this anyone here for the first time to come in? You guys, okay. A lot of folks we find that just haven't ventured into Oak Grove, and this very fine chapel was built, donated by the Park family. Oak Grove Cemetery is a non-profit, non-denominational cemetery. And we're a garden-type cemetery. We've been modeled after Mount Auburn. And Mount Auburn has some unique characteristics that are similar to us, but they ended up melding a cemetery into a garden environment. That was something around 1830s. They were the first in the country, so leading that movement. And there was a group of folks from Boston who came out to determine where they wanted their garden. Well, in Falmouth, there was a group of folks in Falmouth, prominent citizens, that they were looking for something different other than the typical town cemetery. There's no offense to town cemeteries. But anyway, so again, we were looking for a certain burial place, and it was open to all religions, color. There was no restrictions on any of the aspects that you would find. Falmouth in the mid-1800s did have restrictions. And one of the classic always seems to come up, and that's if you were a Quaker. And Quakers were always basically stay up in West Falmouth, and they had their own cemeteries and church up there. It's an interesting study of that time. Soon after Oak Grove Cemetery had opened its gates on Palmer Ave, the main road into Falmouth, that was our main entrance with those beautiful wrought iron gates up there. And it became the fashionable place to be buried. It truly was at the time. When it opened, many of the citizens would exhume their family in different areas and different cemeteries, and they would bring them here to Oak Grove. And the classic example that we always give is we have one Revolutionary War soldier buried here, Jonathan Green. He stands proudly in the cemetery. And people would say, well, wait a minute, you opened up in 1848. How can you have a Revolutionary War? But he was exhumed when he came up. By the way, he was on Washington's staff. We do a lot of research on our folks here. But it was a well-maintained garden, and when they would compare that to the town cemeteries usually would have sheep and goats grazing to keep the grass down. We actually, at this cemetery, they would cut the grass. And you can just see the contrast of a young woman at that time coming into the town cemeteries and walking out with rather dirty shoes that they'd have to clean. But coming in here, they wouldn't have to worry about that. But anyway, just an interesting point to make. We're managed by 14 directors. We have a part-time superintendent, part-time groundskeepers, many volunteers. And we have strong relations with our Falmouth Genealogical Society and with the Historic Society, Museum on the Green. They're kind of key players around the town. We're listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We're listed in the Cultural Resource List for the state of Massachusetts. And we're also listed in the town of Falmouth Resource Inventory. And that was established by the Historic Commission in the town of Falmouth. All these things are very important. You don't really get a lot of cemeteries listed on the National Register. There's an awful lot of folks here buried here. I mean, Fort Catherine League is a big one, but you've got an awful lot of ship's captains. People don't realize that Falmouth actually was very predominant in the shipping years ago, whaling ships primarily. And they built whaling ships here. Let me see, we got about 5,400 souls buried here, and a little more than 1,200 lots that have been set aside for the future. And we have 629 veterans. I mean, that's a big calling, and from what we find out, it's one of the largest buried or interned veterans on the Cape, other than your National Cemetery. The Oak Grove Cemetery as a whole has stood tall as a witness of time. and it passes from season to season for the past 175 years. We've provided peace, harmony, and tranquility for one's final rest. It truly is a very interesting place. If you're welcome, walk around the cemetery, stroll through the many lanes and paths and ways, and they're shaded by oak trees and dogwood trees and cherry trees, and you get to feel that you're at peace. And a lot of folks do come in the cemetery and use it as a park. There's two groups of walking folks that will come in, and they really they enjoy using it as a park. The interesting things is that you might go around the cemetery, you'll notice roads that have certain names on them. Many of the roads, basically the names are memorials. Families will make a donation so they can have a road named after them. It's a way for us to collect additional funds, and it's basically their road for many, many years to come. We honor the men and women of Falmouth that now occupy these hallowed grounds and represent a cross-section of people that built and defended our great nation. And I'm proud to be part of that. I think that's enough of the background of Oak Grove Cemetery. Barry, why don't you get us started here?
Okay, so today is the result of a number of efforts that we have made over the last several years. 3 years ago, we completed a 10-year strategic plan, and part of that was that we had as our highest priority veterans. And so we began something we referred to as the Veterans Project. Initially, we did it because we didn't think that we had really identified and honored all of the veterans that were buried here. And indeed, that was the fact once we got going on our research. The project started with 5 teams, and the 5 teams went out into the cemetery, and we went into every single area we have here. We physically checked each plot, looking for people who might be veterans, but maybe are not on our master list. We identified the condition of the headstones, and in particular, a lot of them are family headstones and they're marble, so we were looking for ones that needed restoration. We also began taking photographs of the conditions, and we also replaced medallions and flags on those where they didn't have them and they were missing. So that was the beginning, and with that done, then we decided we would focus on the Civil War veterans. And that required an awful lot of research, extensive research, to document and verify that indeed they were veterans of the Civil War. We looked at pension files and everything else. And what we did also was we wanted to have the stories of the men. So both their military history as well as what they did after the Civil War was done. And then why would we do all this? Well, our main reason was that we would take those stories and share them with the community, so that it is Falmouth's history, and it is right here, right before us all. Some of the things we also do on an ongoing basis is we do cleaning of the veterans' headstones and the flat markers. And that we did before Memorial Day this year, and different people came out to help us volunteer to do that. And also, placing of flags and the medallions is really a big deal. And it's faithfully done by the Boy Scouts here. We've increased our efforts, and Jerry mentioned it a little bit, with some of the other organizations in town. And one of them is the partnership with the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War. And we are very happy because that was part of the GAR restoration and renovation project we had, which you'll be able to take a look at. We have some Sons of the Union Veterans brothers with us today, 2 of them, and we're honored. We have partnerships with the library here and also with the Museums on the Green, and that's the result right here before you of some of those joint efforts. I was told I had to make sure to say that at the library there is a very large plaque that commemorates those that were Falmouth men in the Civil War. So please, after the event, and if it's raining horribly, I can go through some of the items here that are really very, very interesting. So a few years ago, I had the pleasure, and it really was an honor, to work on a GAR uniform of somebody here in Falmouth. And at the time, I'm going to admit to you, I had no idea what the GAR was. So I was asked, and I'm the perfect person for it, to tell you what that is. So the GAR stands for the Grand Army of the Republic. And of course, the United States is a republic, and the Union Army was the Grand Army of the Republic. So it was a fraternal organization that started after the Civil War, and its members were veterans of either the Union Army, the Navy, the Marines, or the Cutter Service. So the Grand Army of the Republic had hundreds of local posts across the country. And here in Falmouth, ours was called the B.F. Jones Post 206. And it was named for the naval captain, Benjamin Franklin Jones. So in Falmouth, the veterans met at what is now the Chamber of Commerce downtown off of Main Street. And they met 2 times a month. They had officers, but more than anything else, they talked about their shared experiences. And they would go on weekend encampments all over the state of Massachusetts and sometimes in Rhode Island as well. They had uniforms. They had hats. They had special belts with special buckles on it. And they would even get souvenirs from going on the encampments. And this particular one is very famous because of what it says, which is, we drank from the same canteen. And part of that, actually, just if I might add a little bit, is because they were open to the other side, meaning the South. They weren't just all about the Union, because everybody thought the way they thought they should. However, this organization was only about the Union. So they would go to GAR events, they would go to gatherings, they would go and be in parades. And here in Falmouth, this was a huge event on Memorial Day. And when the last person who was a GAR member, who was Andrew W. Davis, died, that ended the post here. And so it closed. And Andrew is buried here, and that was in May of 1934. And this actually, these are from his uniform. Nationally, the GAR was responsible for obviously a lot of things, but 2 significant things are that they helped make Memorial Day a national holiday. And the other part was they worked very hard to get Congress to pass pensions for the widows and for the veterans, and many of them were disabled. By 1956, the last GAR member died, and the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War was its heir. And they are obviously made up of descendants of Union veterans. There's another organization, though, that I need to tell you about, and that is an auxiliary of the B.F. Jones Post. This is the Women's Relief Corps, number 142. So they were established in 1883, and they were established by the Guard to assist the Guard in post-war relief to those veterans. It was made up here in Falmouth of almost all wives of the Guard members. And so what did that group do? They hosted dinners for the veterans. They organized and funded the Falmouth Memorial Day Parade and event. They gave monies to decorate the southern graves. They also purchased iron vases for all of the graves of the soldiers who were buried. And if that wasn't enough, they also, for the Grand Army Hall, got them an organ and new carpet. They donated also to the Soldiers' Home in Massachusetts, and they donated so much that there's a Falmouth room that was named after Falmouth because of the generosity. And that leads me to Mrs. Lincoln. So this is not the First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln. This is Sylvia Lincoln of Falmouth. And she was the president of the WRC for 30 years. On Memorial Day, she not only was in charge of staging the events and all of the things that go with that, but she also read the Gettysburg Address. 30 years, 3 decades she did this. So that leads me to letting you know that there was never, for a very long time, a memorial to Civil War veterans here in Falmouth. And of course, I told you, at the library there's a very large brass plaque with the names, but there wasn't one in Falmouth. And you might say, why in the world is there only one here at Oak Grove Cemetery? Why isn't there one down on the Village Green? Or somewhere more prominent instead of here? And I don't know. Somebody smarter than me is going to have to research that. I do know that the Memorial Day Parade would start at what is now the Chamber of Commerce. And they would march all the way here. And this is where the speeches were given. This is where the prayers were said. This is where everything happened. The singing, whatever it was that was part of that. And there are 2 events that took place that were significant in this happening. And the first one was in 1899, Oak Grove Cemetery gave 2 plots here to the B.F. Jones Post. And then the other thing that happened 11 years later, in 1910, was that there was a black granite memorial placed in the center of those 2 plots, and that was paid for by the Women's Relief Corps. So again, that's all I have for you on the Guard background, but it sets the stage for what you'll see next.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Scott Zielinski. I am the Vice Chair of the Falmouth Select Board, and it's my great pleasure to be here to recall the rich history of how the town of Falmouth honored and remembered our Civil War veterans here at Oak Grove Cemetery. As Mary just depicted, during the Civil War and through the early 1900s, there was a very strong sense of patriotism and support for our boys in blue. According to the Falmouth Enterprise, 81 Falmouth men answered the call to arms, and 16 of them died in service. The majority of them who served in the Army volunteered as a group. In August 1862, 31 Falmouth men traveled by train to New Bedford to enlist in the new company that was being formed, and most of them became the 38th Regiment, Company H. They were also sometimes called the Falmouth Company. The 38th spent much of their time fighting in Louisiana under dreadful, disease-ridden conditions. Another large group of Falmouth served in the Navy. It included B.F. Jones, the veteran whose name was given to our local GAR post. When the rebellion broke out, most of Falmouth able-bodied young men were at sea. Despite this fact, Falmouth sailors signed up for an amazing effort that is not widely known. Under sealed orders from the U.S. War Department, in November 1861, 45 ships from various ports in the north joined forces and sailed south with their holds loaded to the max with New England granite. Their mission was to blockade southern ports by purposely scuttling their own ships. They became known as the Stone Fleet. Of this fleet, 17 were New Bedford whaling ships. Among Falmouth sailors, there was such a strong commitment to serve that the captain and the entire crew of the ship's Majestic was comprised of 11 of our lads. Typically, crew members hailed from many ports, including foreign countries. To have an entire crew come from Falmouth is a claim no other town can make. 7 of the 11 Majestic crew are buried here at Oak Grove. One of the things GAR did to support Civil War veterans was to establish a day of honor and remember their sacrifices. Initially, the day was known as Decoration Day because the graves were decorated with flowers, wreaths, and flags. By late 1800s, it became known as Memorial Day, and many states declared it a legal holiday. Falmouth celebrated Memorial Day with great fanfare, and it began right here at Oak Grove Cemetery. Imagine, if you will, the celebration that took place here on Memorial Day in 1910. In the morning, the Falmouth Brass Band led a procession from GAR headquarters on Main Street to this plot. GAR members rode in front of the procession, followed by the Women's Relief Corps. Then school children marched with little flags. Military exercises were held, graves were decorated, and flowers and flags. The highlight of the day was the unveiling of the large granite monument you'll see, gesture to the GAR monument that we'll all see very shortly. Throngs of people in attendance to honor the dead, and among them were Civil War veterans still surviving 45 years later. Mrs. Lincoln, president of the Women's Relief Corps, gave a moving speech while presenting the monument to the selectmen of Falmouth. She said in part, "The Relief Corps, which I am proud to represent, has procured the monument that we dedicate to the memory of our heroes today. It is an expression of our gratitude and our loyalty that now I present this monument to the selectmen on behalf of the soldiers and sailors of Falmouth." Pardon me, big thumbs. Selectman Silas Hatch replied in a lengthy speech which included, "As chairman of the Board of Selectmen of the town of Falmouth, the honor falls to me, on behalf of the town, to accept from you the monument which you have erected to the memory of Falmouth's sons, who in the day of the nation's trouble left home and friends and went forth to battle for the preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery. To top it off, children sang our national anthems. There were scriptures and prayers, and as always, the highlight was the reading of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Falmouth did itself proud with its early Memorial Day celebrations. Our patriotism was strong while we honored the sacrifices it took to preserve our Union and fight for the abolition of slavery. As the town of Falmouth did over 100 years ago, we are here today to remember and honor our veterans' bravery and sacrifice. May history's lessons never be forgotten. And now, retired Maine Army National Guard Master Sergeant Bob Haskell will read the Gettysburg Address. Master Sergeant.
The Gettysburg Address, delivered by President Abraham Lincoln, Thursday, November 19, 1863. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government by the people, for the people, of the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Hear, hear.
Here, here.
Yeah.
I'm going to read the dedication part of this while we wait for this, and then as the weather allows, we'll go out to see the monument, if that's okay, Jerry? Faith, you want to do it? So pretend we're looking at the stone, okay? And we'll look at it after, is that all right? Before we dedicate the markers in the GAR burial plot, let's learn the soldiers and sailors laid to rest here. For this, I will introduce retired Marine Corps Colonel Kevin Doyle.
So thank you, Scott. Thank you. And thank you, Faith. And where we stand at the monument, it was brand new at the time it was dedicated. It was a plot of land out there, as Mary already described, that was bought by locals to honor those people who had participated in the Civil War. The stone wall was on the back of the border of the grade, and it sloped gently towards the street. But over time, the grade became steeper and steeper, and that's why you'll see the little wall that was built as part of the renovation project that went on today. There's a long pile of stones on the west border, and there's a chain link fence that was added, and the arborvitaes kind of grew right along there in full blossom as well. And this big tree that stands in front of the park now is also part of that growth. How do I know that? It's because Faith told me. So, and then a few years ago, when the board voted to renovate that that monument as a commitment to the veterans in Falmouth. And we thank you even to this day for doing so. When we go out there, as you walk by, you'll see 5 flags that are to the left of the monument. If you start with the second one in, that would be the marker of William T. Ford, who was a sailor, who was a Navy seaman, who was born in Marshfield, but he moved to Falmouth when he was a child, and he died here at the age of 75. He was the first person to be buried in that plot, 5 months after the monument was dedicated. Before the war, William Ford was a green hand on a whaler. You can probably guess from the title, a green hand was the newest guy on the ship. Not a job that you'd want to have. It's pretty gutsy for a guy who was 5'8". I'm sure he had a tough time with it. The Civil War broke out in April of 1861 when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston. 30 days later, young William Ford enlisted in the Navy. He was a seaman in the Gulf of Mexico on the USS Colorado. And we'll be talking about the Colorado again. The Colorado is one of the most powerful ships in our fleet, and it sailed by steam power with the side wheel on it, as well as by wind. So it was very maneuverable and very effective. The Colorado was did itself proud when its crew sank a Confederate schooner in Pensacola. There was an armed privateer that could have done a lot of damage to our fledgling Navy and northern commerce. But under the cover of night, 100 men snuck in. They burned it right to the hull, right down to the bottom, and it sank. There's no record whether William Ford was on that expedition or not, but it certainly sounds like something that he would have been happy to do. Because he continued his whaling career after he left the war. This next one over to the left of William Ford is William Jenkins. He was a patriot when the Union needed patriots. He was a Falmouth native, and he was a painter who lived on Shore Street, so he probably would have belonged to the Old Stone Dock Association, just so you know. And Jim Crossan would have signed him up. We had suffered horrific losses at Antietam. In fact, Antietam was the turning point in the war. Up until the first couple of years, the Confederates were winning. Antietam was a bloody, long, horrible war, a horrible battlefield, the deadliest day in American history. 23,000 American casualties. 4,000 died. It was just devastating. So, after it was over, because the Union won, Abraham Lincoln had to keep up the initiative, and so he drafted each state to allocate some men to the cause. Massachusetts was asked for 19,000 men to serve for 9 months. William Jenkins immediately went, and this is probably when they all went over to New Bedford to enlist, and he went with 3 other Falmouth men. He joined the GAR Republic's 38th Regiment, as was mentioned, and became part of the Falmouth contingent. They went by train and boat down to New Bern, North Carolina, which is right out there on the coast. And he would have participated in several missions while he was there, including the seizure of the Goldsboro Bridge. The Goldsboro Bridge was a Confederate line of communication up to support Richmond. And so by breaking up the Confederate supply line, that gave General Ambrose a chance to wage war against Richmond. He returned to Boston with his unit 9 months later, as he was requested to do, and he was discharged at the age of 23. He suffered from chronic rheumatism after the war, and he died at the age of 74 in 1914. Next one over will be William Holbrook Swift. there's plenty of Bill Swifts around. I was kind of thought I might see Bill here today. And he's actually not buried where we see him right there. His ashes were sent here to be for interment, and he's an unmarked grave, and there's now a large tree where he would have been. Oak Grove didn't even know he was buried here until they were researching, and they came across one of these log books that had his name, and beside it was GAR Navy. And Lot 25 would have been his assigned resting space, but he's recognized up there. He was born and raised in Falmouth and went to sea as a young man. He joined the Navy in 1864. That would have been towards the end of the war. And he was lived 8 different ships. Let's see here. Good luck. So in 1864, the only port that was open to the Confederates, you heard about the Stone Navy already, where they went and they blockaded all the ships. That's also one of the reasons why there aren't a whole lot of whaling ships left, is because they were all sunk in support of the Civil War. And in 1864, Wilmington, North Carolina was about the only port that they could get in and out of. That is where the USS Colorado went in and participated in the bombardment. So at this point, the Colorado was in the second tier back because a lot of them were ironclads. This was a wooden vessel. It was struck 6 times by returning fire. And after this was engaged, the second attack came in January 1865. And again, a Falmouth captain was involved in that battle. So it's really kind of interesting that the Colorado had seen quite a few Falmouth men, and this particular port, this particular battle, is a recurring theme for these who are buried with us. After the war, Swift made a life for himself in the Boston area, and he kept a summer home in Sipawissa. His obituary says that he was well known in Boston as a constable and an auctioneer for 40 years. He died in Dorchester in 1918, and his ashes were buried here in the following May. Finally up there is George Hines. He was born in 1874, so he clearly was not even alive during the Civil War. But in 1932, he was buried in an unmarked grave with a vacant space separating him from the Civil War veterans. And when you get there, you'll see the relationship of the plots. Later stones were piled on top of his grave. But he enlisted as a private from Woods Hole in the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry Regiment in 1899. He was discharged after 10 years of service in 1909. 5 years later, when he's 44 years old, he volunteered for World War I. We don't know why he was buried in the Civil War plot, but he served his country for 10 years, and he wanted to enlist again when he was 41 years old. So Oak Grove thought it appropriate to remember his service too. Then there's one other marker up there, and it's right next to the stone. And that's the marker of the unknown soldiers and sailors who might not otherwise be recognized. Just to probe into the earth to see if they could hit anything. There were several strikes, but after several hits, they realized the possibility that even more bodies were up there. So that became the grave of the unknown and otherwise unrecognized soldiers and sailors. So it's there to honor them. And today, it's an honor to be part of this ceremony.
Thank you, Colonel.
Thank you.
So what we're gonna do now is, you're gonna let me get out of here, and then we're all gonna file out and do the dedication. We'll do the procession, and Faith will get us to the plot, Jerry, and then we'll make the dedication and finish the rest of our program. Faith? So let us reflect on the deep sorrow caused by the death of a single young soldier with the reading of the poem, The Vacant Chair. Henry S. Washburn of Kingston, Massachusetts wrote The Vacant Chair in 1861 to memorialize the death of Willie Grout, an 18-year-old from Massachusetts. Willie died in battle and was buried shortly before Thanksgiving. The poem was put to song, which became popular throughout the remainder of the war, as many families would experience a vacant chair. Later it became a mainstay in dedication ceremonies given by the sons of the Union veterans of the Civil War from Massachusetts. Here to read The Vacant Chair is Commander Mike Rice from the Taunton Camp of Massachusetts Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. Please welcome Commander Rice. Commander? Yes, sir.
Thank you, everyone. We shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him while we breathe our evening prayer. When 1 year ago we gathered, joy was in his mild blue eyes. Now the golden cord is severed, and our hope in ruins lie. We shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him while we breathe our evening prayer. At our fireside, sad and lonely, often will the bosom swell, a remembrance of the story of how our noble Willie fell. How we strove to bear the banner through the thickest of the fight and uphold our country's honor in the strength of manhood's might. True, they tell us, wreaths of glory evermore will deck his brow, but this soothes the anguish only, sweeping over our heartstrings now. Sleep today, O fallen, O early fallen, in the green and narrow bed. Dirges from the pine and cypress mingle with the tears that we shed.
Commander Rice, please dedicate the new markers.
On behalf of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, I dedicate these markers to the memory of the men who offered their lives for the preservation of our country in her hour of greatest need. They pledged themselves to the protection of our flag, the preservation of our unity, and the guarantee of equal rights under our flag and Constitution. May our spirits here, over these graves, be imbued anew with the spirit of loyalty.
Thank you. Thank you. Oak Grove Cemetery Board of Directors President Jerry Luby will cut the ribbon and flowers will be laid on the GAR monument by Faith Lee, a member of the board and chair of the GAR Plot Renovation Committee. They will be accompanied by Blake Hopewell, pipe major and leader of the Brian Baru Pipe Band. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the dedication portion of our event. There is more to come. Please follow the procession to the grave of the last GAR member in Falmouth, Andrew W. Davis. After that, you can see some more of the display up close of the Civil War era belongings of Mr. Davis and enjoy some wine, refreshments, and some more music. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you all for gathering here today. As was mentioned, Andrew W. Davis is one of the last, it was the last, of the Falmouth Civil War veterans. Yes, he's one of the old Davises. He was born in 1840 to a mother whose name was Eldred. They started to get the sense of his pedigree. He married Sarah Crocker from another fine family, another fine Falmouth family, when he was 21 years old. That was in the year 1861, the first year of the Civil War. She died very suddenly later that year. Perhaps it was heartache, perhaps it was patriotism, but either way, Andrew Davis went to New Bedford and enlisted as a private in the Union Army in 1862, along with those other Falmouth volunteers that you just heard about. He was assigned to the 38th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment and mustered with the other new recruits, moving by train down to Baltimore to participate in the defense of Washington, D.C. before moving on to his next assignment. After 4 months, in November, Private Davis would have boarded a ship for passage to Mississippi before reaching his destination in Louisiana. The Massachusetts 38th was an infantry unit that operated in the New Orleans area at the mouth of the Mississippi River. You may recall that General Grant had devised a plan to provide the Confederacy along the Mississippi River to prevent the South from reinforcing itself between theaters of war. The river became even more important when northern states got frustrated with the Union forces and decided that they would help the Confederacy if the North could not keep up the commerce on the river. Naturally, President Lincoln ordered the Army and Navy to get immediate control of the river. The 38th was ordered to join action at Port Hudson, which was upriver from Baton Rouge, which was a dug-in defensive position on a high bluff at a sharp bend in the Mississippi River. It's a stiff challenge for the Union. Port Hudson turned into one of the longest sieges of the war. It took 5 months of combat on both land and on the river before the Confederates at Port Hudson surrendered. It was exhausting for both sides. After Port Hudson, he went back to Baton Rouge to take charge of confiscated plantations. By then, Andrew Davis was pretty well worn out. Like many of his fellow soldiers, he had succumbed to fatigue and the malarial conditions of the swamps they fought in.
He was evacuated to a military hospital in Virginia for recovery and discharge after 24 months of duty. In his youth, Andrew had learned masonry, and after the war he returned to that trade in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston. It was there that he met and married his second wife in 1871. 4 years later, the couple returned to Falmouth, and by 1879 they purchased a home in T-Ticket and lived out their lives there, as, by the way, one of the few families living in T-Ticket at the time. Andrew worked on some of the finest homes in Falmouth, in Falmouth and Woods Hole, as a mason, including the home of Joseph Story Fay. He also installed one of the vaults that's in the Falmouth National Bank. It's up to you to find it. Andrew Davis stayed committed to the community service throughout his life. He was a leader in the Odd Fellows, the Masons, the VFW, the Grand Army of the Republic gatherings, events, and meetings. Andrew was Falmouth's last Civil War veteran, and he died in his home in T-Ticket at the age of 92. At his funeral, he humbly requested that no special military honors be rendered. That may have been true in 1934, but today we are unabashed in our military pride in Falmouth's last Civil War soldier. May he rest in eternal peace.
Good job.